Thanks to all of you for being here. We wanted to invite you in for this news conference today because, up until this historic moment, you've been a part of this. Whenever we've had the delegates, for example, come out and meet together with me and meet with the media, whenever we had those invitations issued to you, you were there and you helped to prepare the way. And your colleagues were there in major, major numbers. The media presence in Rome for this was substantial, and you'd be probably more aware than I am of the coverage that took place back here at home, because I would have missed a lot of it, being involved in the busyness of the day-to-day over there. So given the involvement that the media has had in this up until now, we wanted to offer this opportunity for you to come and see if you've got any follow-up questions as we move for this event. So I'll start with a couple of introductory comments, more or less my observations, I guess, on what took place through the week, and then we can open it up to see what questions you might have. So Marion recalled for everybody what took place last week, those 3 distinct private meetings followed by the general audience. And this was very much an encounter between the Pope and the Indigenous delegates. I, together with some of the other bishops that had been involved in the preparation for this, we were really there just as witnesses. We sat in on each of the meetings and listened and observed. And I'd have to say that, I'll speak personally, it was a privileged moment, because I think we all appreciated, delegates included, that we were witnessing something historic. I checked with some people that I know over in Rome, and we're reasonably sure that no other delegation to the Vatican has ever had the attention that this particular delegation did receive from the Holy Father. To receive a total of 5 hours in the space of a week is unprecedented and really unheard of. And it is probably one of the strongest signals of how seriously the Pope takes this. And 4 of those 5 hours, I can tell you, were listening on his part. It was quite extraordinary. They each came into his office. It was in the office, the same office where you'll see often the Pope seated across the table from a head of state. He was in that same room, so already we see that he was elevating the significance of this just by the very place where the meeting occurred. They came in, he put them immediately at ease, took their seats, and then they just spoke. And the Pope just listened, and he listened very, very deeply. And as I was watching this, and especially watching the delegates, I could see that they were coming into the room, coming into this encounter with the Pope, aware that they had been entrusted with a heavy responsibility by their own people to share with the Pope what they felt they needed to say. They spoke in their own name, they spoke in the name of their people. It was very forthright, very truthful, very respectful, very gracious throughout. And as I chatted with delegates off and on through the week, one of the things that they continually kept saying to me was how clear it was to them that the Pope was listening very, very deeply. And of course, that came out with great clarity in the statement that he gave to the group at the end. It was, if you've had a chance to read the text, you'll know, and if you haven't had a chance, I'd certainly encourage you to read it, because the Pope spoke in very, very powerful terms, very directly, and it was clear that this was something that he had a hand in composing. He had clearly done what he said he would do, reflect deeply upon all that he had heard through the week. One of the things that struck me is he said that he allowed himself, to the degree that he could, to the degree that anybody could, enter into the stories that he had heard, to allow himself to try to experience for himself the pain, the anguish, and the trauma. And it was out of that felt experience that he responded to the people. He responded very forthrightly, having first recalled the beauty of their cultures, their traditions, what we need to be learning from their giftedness. He signaled in a particular way the wise saying that when we speak and plan for today, we always have to have at least 7 generations in mind. He highlighted that because for generations, people have been experiencing trauma and intergenerational trauma, and we have a responsibility now to do whatever we can to heal things now so that the healing can reverberate into future generations. In terms of the anguish and the hurt that the people had experienced, he was very direct, very forthright. He did not mince his words, and spoke about the devastating effects of colonization, which he qualified as ideological colonization. That is to say, the taking over of one's very own mindset with something foreign to their own, and how that was for the people very, very devastating. And so out of that awareness, he issued his apology. And we had been hearing for the longest time from Indigenous peoples that they just want to hear those 3 words, I'm sorry. And the Pope took it further. He sought pardon of God, first of all, as we must. Then he said, I'm very sorry. And then together with the bishops, sought pardon. I was in that room at the time, and I was in that room with the delegates after the Pope had left, and was able to see firsthand the excitement, the joy, the hope that was animating everybody. Everyone left there on a real high, having accepted the apology in the words of the AFN leader, Chief Antoine. The sense that we had touched a milestone, that we had been part of something historic, and that we were part of something that was now a springboard into future action for healing and reconciliation. The Pope was clear that, words, as important as they are, can't just stand alone. It has to be followed by some concrete action. And encouraged us as bishops to continue the journey together with the Indigenous peoples, walking together, dialoguing together, to see, all right, what more can we be doing now and into the future so that we can move meaningfully, constructively, fruitfully along the path of healing and reconciliation that we all seek. So, that I would say is, in very brief summary form, how the week unfolded, some of my initial impressions of it. So I'll stop there, and if you've got any particular questions that you want to pose that we can talk about, I'd be glad to do that.
You mentioned about moving forward with action.
Yep.
What are some of your plans from here?
Well, there's a couple of things that are already unfolding. So at a national level, of course, we've got the Indigenous Reconciliation Fund that's been established by the Bishops of Canada. Also at the national level, I think what we need to do is look for some mechanisms to continue the bilateral relationships that we've been establishing through this process, so that we can have ongoing dialogue with the MNC, the AFN, the ITK, and others. Across the board, too, we're realizing the need for education. Education in our seminaries, education in our schools. A lot of education has been taking place, especially in our schools, as you would likely know. But there always need to be more, it seems to me, because we have a lot of people recently arrived in our country that wouldn't understand this particular history, wouldn't understand what's at stake. So how do we educate on that? So across the board, there's some things that I think we need to do. At the same time, though, the key to this, it seems to me, is local. What can we be doing locally? Because Indigenous peoples across the country are distinct and they're autonomous. They have their own giftedness, their cultural traditions, and so on. How do we enter into dialogue with them locally? How do we hear from them what their needs are? And how do we work out together with them how we can walk together and help? In all of this, we've got to be really careful, it seems to me, to avoid a perpetuation of a colonial mentality whereby we would say to them, okay, here's your problems, we know how to fix it, and here's what we will do for you. Those days are over. They have to be over. How do we understand your needs? How do we find solutions together? And that means that it will take time to understand what that, in fact, will look like. And then I would take it even a step further. And this is for everybody in the country, it would seem to me. Because one of the things that emerged for me, probably a key learning that emerged for me, is that reconciliation happens one relationship at a time. This is something that builds over time. We use the word reconciliation a lot, but sometimes it seems to be hard-pressed to define it. And we might find different people giving it different definitions. We've got to come to a common understanding of what we mean by that, what we hope for from it. And what's clear to me is that the very heart of it is good relationships. Precisely what the Holy Father has demonstrated here. The people met him in person. He met them in person. They looked one another in the eye. They heard the tone of the voice. They opened their hearts to one another in a genuine interpersonal encounter that develops as the basis for a good relationship. And the more that we can walk with one another as fellow human beings to begin with, brothers and sisters as part of this common home of creation, and understand to trust one another and respect one another, more concrete actions, it seems to me, will emerge out of that on this path for healing and reconciliation. It's a long way ahead.
Just picking up on that topic of relationships, I know back to the discovery of Kamloops, you did a video message with Chief Wilton Littlechild, and he was on the delegation as well.
Yep.
I was wondering, with those relationships, how has that changed for you in recent months and years, and how will it change moving forward?
Great question. Thank you for that. Because, you know, I'd have to say in all honesty that I've been on my own journey in this. And anytime you enter into relationship with another, there will be a journey of learning, of openness. And the more you're in relationship with another, the more you spend time with one another, the more the trust develops that you can gradually open up to the other and tell your truth, tell your story. And, you know, having listened, you know, for the last number of years to story after story of heartache and trauma, but at the same time, stories of resilience, stories of growth, of self-possession, of wanting to move ahead, the more the trust develops. And on the basis of that, I'm finding that as I'm listening to the stories often of brokenness, it brings it all home to me personally. I think it's probably fair to say that anybody who's been journeying in this realizes that we've got to grapple with truth and reconciliation within one's own heart. Right? What is the truth of my weakness? What is the truth of my brokenness? What is the truth of my need? And acknowledging that truth and hearing that truth, how do I reconcile myself to it? And in doing so, how do I become more real? And how do I grow as a human being? And the more we find the way to open up to one another at that level, and that takes a lot of trust, takes a lot of time. But the more we can open up to one another at that level, the more we are really forging that path ahead of genuine healing and genuine reconciliation. It's a personal journey and cannot help but be otherwise, it seems to me.
We did hear from some First Nation members that thought the apology didn't quite go far enough, where the language was about the individuals and played a role in residential schools, but not the Catholic Church as a whole.
Yeah.
What's your reaction to that?
A couple of things. I think what happens, first of all, is when you're in the room with the Pope, when you've had a week to discuss with him what's been when you've shared so openly, and when you hear him respond so openly, personally, I don't think there's any question that the apology was genuine. It absolutely was. And those that were in the room would say to me afterwards, that's what we needed to hear. On the question of whether or not, you know, the apology pertaining to particular individuals, you know, I think people need to keep in mind that the Church exists in her members. It's precisely in the members of the Church that we find the Church, that we encounter the Church. And so to say that certain people were personally responsible for heinous acts, right, is true at one level, but they also, in virtue of their membership in the church, also represent the church also. And so it's clear, I mean, just from that theological point of view, but also from the personal, experiential point of view in the room, that the apology was exactly what needed to be said.
You touched on your journey towards reconciliation. I was wondering if you could, if you're willing, to touch a bit on how you come to terms with some of the facts that you are part of an institution that caused harm. The apology has happened decades after it ended. I was wondering if you could support.
Yeah, there's a couple of things to that. First of all, I, together with many other bishops and priests, together with many other Catholics, are heartbroken at what took place. And even though we weren't personally responsible, we still have received this legacy of pain and of shame. And I don't think one can help feeling that somehow sharing in that guilt and the heartache and the heartbrokenness. Many Catholics would say the same thing. And so we realize that today we do have a responsibility, even though we may not have been personally involved. How do we help in the healing? How do we help move forward? At the same time, we need to keep in mind that, you know, the whole faith of the church cannot be judged by people who were not living it. Right? So if you're abusing people in whatever way that might be, if you are belittling their culture, if you are denying their heritage, that's contrary to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And the Pope was very, very clear on that. So we can't judge the whole in that sense by the horrible actions of a few. And it's on that basis that we continue to keep in mind that the gospel is good. The church exists for good. We want to be serving. We want to be reconciling. We want to be healing. And even as we feel that shame and pain, and we do, and the Pope himself said it very strongly. He says, I feel indignation and shame at what took place. But we keep in mind the overarching view of what the church is, what the Lord calls us to be, and move forward on that basis.
And how do you hope that message of reconciliation will be reflected in individual parishes moving forward after this apology?
I think it's already starting to be reflected on the basis of what I'm hearing. Now, I'm just home a couple of days, but I've already been receiving many messages from people of the hope that they're feeling now, of the eagerness they're feeling to see this continue and be perpetuated long term. The more we can educate one another and our parishioners as to what has happened and the responsibility that's ours now, I think the more we're going to see actions take place. People have been, even within the church, you know, parishioners have been looking forward to a sign of hope, an indication of where we can go. For a while now, we've received it in this extraordinary gesture from the Pope, but as the Holy Father himself says, the words are not the end of this. How are we going to move forward? And on the basis of people that I've been speaking with, not just in our parishes, but also in our Catholic institutions, they're eager to be moving forward on this.
You said that Indigenous people have been asking this for a long time. Do you have a sense of why now and why it took so long?
Well, there's a couple of factors there too. Keep in mind COVID, right? So we've been planning this for quite some time. We would have hoped to have this encounter with the Pope a few years ago, but at least twice it was delayed. But at least finally we were able to do it. The other thing too, though, is that for Pope Francis, encounter is everything. It's a central concept of his papacy. He calls the world to develop a culture of encounter, whereby he means relationships of mutual openness, mutual encounter, mutual discernment, mutual understanding. And so it was key early on, or key to our understanding early on, that any apology that would come from the Pope, from this particular Pope, would need to be preceded by an encounter, a personal encounter. You can't arrange meetings with the Pope overnight. It takes some time. But what we experienced last week was just how right that was, because the delegates, through their openness and through their sharing, were able to share their heart with the Pope. He heard them firsthand, not secondhand, and then he responded to them from their heart. And the way that they responded at the end of that general audience and then afterwards taught me this was the right thing to do at the right time for them.
You also talked about how this is so intimate, and being there, you took time to also listen and witness. What was the feeling like for you hearing those stories? I know we have heard them over the years, but
Yeah.
to be there with the Pope listening to those stories, what was that encounter like?
It was a great privilege. It was a great blessing. It was a humbling thing, I'd have to say. I was very proud of the delegates, and including our own Alberta delegates. Obvious. This was a courageous thing for them to do. It could not have been an easy thing for them to do, and yet they realized that somehow this was required of them by the historic moment, and above all, by their people. I often heard them say, "I'm doing this for my people. I'm doing this for those that had been in residential schools. I'm doing this for survivors who can't be here. I'm doing this for the students that had been to school and perhaps died in the school environment," and so on. Very, very heavy responsibility, and yet they did it. They stood up, and so to watch that, to get a sense of how they were rising to the moment for the sake of their people and bringing it forward in a genuine hope for healing, that they can themselves move forward. I found that to be, as I say, humbling, but also instructive. You know, how am I as an individual, how are we as individuals willing to take a good look at our personal histories, our own personal need for healing? How do we bring that forward to another to find the healing that we all seek?
There's just so much trauma there, right?
Great deal of trauma. And there was a lot of, I can say, yes, there were a lot of tears in that room too, as people shared. And to see how the Pope responded so gently and so lovingly to them, and they felt it, they could feel that they were heard, they were understood, and they were being cared for.
Did you hear anything or learn anything as they were talking? Did you hear anything that surprised you?
No. I think what they had brought to the Holy Father are things that we have all heard before. So I didn't hear anything new there.
On the question of timing, there's been a bit of frustration I've been hearing that it took the discovery of the unmarked grave for what feels like this action to happen. From your perspective, do you feel like it would have happened had we not had ground penetrating radar? Or do you think that
Oh, yes, it would have, because in fact we started the planning prior to those initial news reports that came out of Kamloops. This is something that actually coming out of the TRC, the bishops have been talking among themselves, how do we reach out in new ways with new initiatives? And so that's a number of years ago now that the idea of a delegation going to Rome began to emerge. I think it's fair to say that there was certainly an elevated sense of urgency, that was added to this with the news reports, but it's something that preceded them.
I don't think there's officially has been a plan for the visit, but that has been discussed. Can you address sort of the idea of people coming to Canada to make an apology or to meet with survivors? I know it's not official yet.
Yeah, no, it isn't official. Now the Pope said, he said long ago in October, they had every intent, he wants to come to Canada. And the way that things unfold is that it's only the Vatican that will formally confirm dates, places, and these. So we're waiting like everybody else. But what I would want to say is that the fact that the Pope gave this extraordinary apology in Rome in no way precludes a papal visit. So I think people might be worried that since he did this in Rome, there won't be a papal visit. But he's told us that there will be, and this will be an opportunity for him to reiterate what he said on Canadian soil, which we understand is of critical importance for the Indigenous peoples because of their connection with the land. And the Pope gets it too. Beautiful reflections in his talk about that show his understanding of their rootedness in the land. So when, where, that's all to be determined, but we can anticipate someday it will happen.
What would you like to see in terms of that visit?
What would I like to see? I'd like to see in some way, and I don't know how we'd pull it off in the context of a papal visit because they're very complicated things. But somehow a repetition here of what we saw in Rome. And by that I mean, again, I'm going to go back to that sense of encounter. How can we fashion a sense of people actually encountering the Pope? How can we fashion an opportunity for the Pope to hear those voices again? It wouldn't, I don't know how we could replicate an in-office experience in the context of a papal visit. But the principles, I think, are something we'd want to see carried forward, enabling the Pope to encounter the people and in this way model that we want to be walking together. One of the more beautiful moments for me was the presentation to the Pope of a pair of moccasins that were specially made for him. They even went to the trouble of finding out his shoe size, and they had them especially made as an invitation to the Pope, please come and walk with us. And so how do we have a papal visit that demonstrates the Pope walking with the Indigenous peoples? That would be a beautiful thing to demonstrate.
If there's one thing you wanted the people of Edmonton to hear today, what would it be?
Well, it would be a repetition of the Pope's words that he said to the Indigenous peoples on a couple of occasions in the course of the week. The Church stands with you. Those are the words that I think need to continue to echo and reverberate. The Church does indeed stand with and will continue to stand with and walk with the Indigenous peoples.